All right, as we kind of complete the push to get people back inside, we're going to move to our next panel. This is one that is obviously very relevant right now. This is October 7th and beyond, moderated by Brian McDodwell, Executive Director of the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. He's joined by Mr. Rami Khouri, Distinguished Public Policy Fellow at the Issam Institute of the American University of Beirut, Professor Chuck Freilich, former Deputy National Security Advisor in Israel and Adjunct Associate Professor of Political Science at Columbia University and Senior Fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, and Professor Asaf Moghadam, Dean of the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy, and Strategy at Reichman University, and Mr. Barak Ravid, Foreign Policy and National Security Correspondent for Axios. Please welcome our panel.
There we go, sorry. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm very grateful for the invitation from the Soufan Center to be here with you all today. I also want to give a big thanks to the Soufan Center for inviting us to bring down 4 of our amazing West Point cadets. So you'll see them, a couple of them in here right now maybe, wearing their awesome white over grays, so they stand out, so please go say hi. They are, it's amazing when you think about it. These are amazing young leaders who were not even born on that fateful day 23 years ago, which makes me feel very old when I'm teaching them, even older when they get none of my Seinfeld references in the classroom. But despite that, they have decided to choose terrorism as their concentrated field of study, and they've decided to choose a lifetime of service to their nation. So we're very grateful for that and very grateful to have them here. So please go say hi. So with that, when Chris and Colin told me which panel they wanted me to moderate, it was both exciting and daunting. Exciting because of the amazing individuals that I'm up here with, but also daunting due to the topic, which is October 7 and beyond. It's a topic that is, of course, complex, challenging, and even emotional. But it is critically important that we have these conversations at events such as this, where experienced and knowledgeable people in the field can openly discuss and debate these critical challenges. So with that, I'll ask Chuck to kick us off and provide maybe some opening thoughts, if you will, on where do you feel that we stand in terms of the war at this point, 1 year in? What has been achieved, what has not, perhaps?
So first of all, good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I join you in thanking the Soufan Center for inviting us. It's an important topic. I'm going to try and run very quickly through what the primary players have achieved and not achieved in the course of this year, and it's quite hard to believe that it's been a year-long war. But first of all, Hamas achieved some of its primary objectives. They dealt Israel an absolutely devastating blow on October 7th. They brought the Palestinian issue back to the agenda after maybe a decade that it had been pushed aside somewhat. They postponed, probably not derailed, but postponed the normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and that would have had, I believe, nothing less than transformational effects on the region. They survived the Israeli response, not self-evident. But the big question is what conclusions the Palestinian people will derive from this, from the devastation of Gaza, from the political aspects. And I think Israel, to switch gears for a moment, Israel went from the devastating beginning to what is, on a purely military basis, an overwhelming success. Hamas has been defeated as a coherent military organization. It's no longer capable of mounting more than some isolated guerrilla attacks, the occasional rocket. It is no longer a coherent fighting force, and all those who said that conventional armies can't defeat terrorist organizations. From that point of view, it's been quite successful. Politically, Israel's been less successful in the sense that Hamas, it's not the governing body that it was before the war, but it's still has significant influence. The hostage situation has been a colossal failure, and Israel's international standing has taken a heavy hit, including in the US, and I'll come back to that. The big question is whether the two primary sides, let's say Israel and the Palestinians as a whole, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, do the two sides have an end game? Where do they want to go when this is over? Israel has not announced an end game, and I think that's been a primary failure on the part of the prime minister, and the absence of the end game actually endangers the military achievements. Israel may find itself in a long-term occupation of Gaza. I think that's about the last thing that it needs. The Palestinians have to ask themselves if the Hamas attack on October 7th didn't put the final nail in the coffin of the two-state solution. And they may very well have done that, and that, of course, has major ramifications for the Palestinians, whether they have any prospects of achieving a state, maybe even at any time, let alone in the near future. The US-Israeli relationship led to unprecedented, really remarkable strategic cooperation. President Biden's response from Israel's perspective could not have been better. On three occasions, sending 2 aircraft carrier groups and other assets and massive military aid, diplomatic aid. And we saw the US manifesting its primacy in the region as compared to the other superpowers. It's basically an American game. And at the same time, American deterrence was only partially successful in the sense that it didn't prevent Hezbollah from firing. The primary objective was to deter Iran, and there it was partially successful back in the fall in October, and again recently in August, end of July, August. But in April, Iran launched a massive attack on Israel, actually the first time that Iran has ever attacked directly, and it was essentially neutralized by the US-led coalition. And that was not just a major military success, but just remarkable, because out of the 300 plus missiles, et cetera, that were fired, just a couple got through. But it was a huge success of the anti-Iranian axis that the US has been trying to build for the last few years. Not just the US, but Israel with a number of Arab states, the Gulf states, and Egypt and Jordan, and even a number of European states, first and foremost the French and the British. So on the one hand, the war has demonstrated the greatest level of strategic cooperation between the two countries, arguably ever, maybe 73. Some of us remember that. But it also, I think, exposed the differences. And in the last few months, we've seen growing criticism from the administration, and we, of course, have seen large-scale opposition in the public, domestically, mostly on the Democratic left. And we saw what happened on the campuses last year, including some foreign instigation. Some of you probably know that better than I do. And finally, the issue of the Iranian-led axis of resistance. I mistakenly almost sometimes say axis of evil because it's pretty similar. But Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and sundry Shiite militia groups. The axis, on the one hand, said the war starts with a resounding success, even though not all the members were aware of it. It is an important step in the decades-long strategy. I call it attrition until destruction, a long-term strategy of Israel's destruction. And they viewed this as a huge step in that process. And for the first time, they believed that maybe they had found that they had found the answer to Israel's overwhelming conventional superiority. And not only the answer to that, that they had now achieved superiority. And to the extent that that perception is really held in Tehran and elsewhere, then that leads to all sorts of ramifications for the future. I mentioned the first time that Iran ever attacked Israel directly and massively in April. The nuclear program continues. And at the same time, I think that the war also demonstrated the limitations of this axis, because If one of Hamas's objectives when the war began was to draw Iran and Hezbollah in so that it would be a multi-front war, big time, they failed to do that. And it's clear that the different parties in this axis have some different interests. So I'll leave it at there, trying to present the balance of what's happened in the last year.
Excellent. Thank you, Chuck. It's really a host of important topics that you teed up for us. If I can turn to Rami and maybe, given all those topics, ask you to provide some perspective on how you situate these events in sort of a broader regional and historical context.
Yeah, thank you very much to the Soufan Group and to all who helped organize this, and for having me on the panel with my friends and colleagues. I'm always intrigued when I attend events like this or hear lectures about terrorism or Israel or Iran or Palestine, whatever. I almost never, and this applies to this morning so far, I never hear stories about individual human beings in the Middle East or in China or in Iran or in other places, I mean, in operative lands that are related to this issue. And I think that's a big weakness. What matters for individuals around the world, whether it's here in the United States in this decisive moment, or in the Middle East or elsewhere, the collective sentiments of ordinary people are what ultimately drive national policy and the well-being or regression of their countries. I think that's a pretty clear fact of history. It can be deterred by a short-term military advantage or economic advantage or whatever, but in the long run, it's what the masses of people feel that will ultimately manifest itself in policy. So in that context, I'd like to, I tried to do the David Letterman 10 points, but I couldn't find 10, so I'll give you my 9 points about what I think is significant. Each is very short because of the time limit, I know. First of all, the October 7 attack can only be understood in the context of three arenas: the act itself, the deeper context of it, how it happened, where it came from, why it happened, and the legacy that it leaves behind. Those three contexts have to be together analyzed to fully understand what it means. And this includes acts by movements like Hamas, acts by countries like Israel, the United States, Iran, others, and acts by individuals, or even sentiments by individuals. If you look at public opinion around the Middle East or around the West or the world, reflecting public sentiments, those have to be taken into consideration. Number two, that this October 7 and its precedent and legacy can only be properly understood as the latest, the October 7, meaning the attack and the Israeli response, can only be understood in the context of the century of conflict between Zionism and Palestinian Arabism, or the Arab-Israeli conflict as we call it today. It's almost exactly a century ago that this conflict started with the Balfour Declaration, then in 1922-23, the mandate of the League of Nations, in which Britain formally agreed to prepare a homeland or a Jewish state for the Jewish people. This is back in 22. And that was really the beginning of the conflict. So it's gone on for a century, and this is one of the consequences. If you don't look at the century, you're not ever going to fully understand what's going on. Number three, we have the act itself, the attack of October 7, and there are so many dimensions of it that still have to be identified and clearly understood, and it clearly includes acts of classic terrorism, where you attack civilians for a political purpose, and there are also acts of what clearly would be understood as legitimate resistance to military occupation. And this, of course, gets us into very complex, debatable territory, but when you look at the wider picture and you see the legal framework that most of the people of the world accept, that a militarily occupied or subjugated people has a right to resist by any means possible. This is UN standard policy and the resolutions of the General Assembly and in votes in the UN. So I'm not saying what is the most important. I'm saying you have to look at the whole context to understand what happened and what its consequences will be. The post-October 7 Israeli response also has many, many dimensions that have to be disaggregated and looked at. Of course, Israel has a right to defend itself, as everybody does, but it also has an obligation to respect the norms of war and the decency of humanity in treating other human beings in a war or in a political conflict. But the unprecedented intensity and nature of the Israeli attack, which the International Court of Justice says is plausible genocide, and many people around the world support that, other people question it. It's not just the intensity and the nature of it, and the fact that it's supported heavily by people around the world, but also opposed, that it's also live on TV, on social media. We've never experienced a day-to-day live genocide, and there are some sites that you can go to that will tell you every day what happened. Number 4, the Western support. I used Western broadly because not all the West supports, but the American, British-led support for Israel's response is very striking. And the fact that the US and the UK are often in the lead of this, and both of the countries' leaders have been subjected to court action accusing them of complicity in genocide, and they're fighting that in court now. I think this is really important to understand. Why is the West broadly supporting this, knowing that there are so many elements of it that are criminal against the law, and why are the U.S. and the U.K. Leading this process? The 5th point, I would say, is the global support for Palestinian rights in general, not just support for Hamas doing what it did, but generally the outpouring of global support for Palestinian rights and protests around the world, but also around the West. And even here in the United States and down the street at various universities, this is unprecedented. The Palestine issue has probably become the biggest current global advocacy issue that generates passion and protest, not just in the global South, but also in many parts of the global North. And this is something that we have to come to terms with. Why is this happening? Number 6, the impact on, or the role and impact of domestic and international law in this crisis is a point that will resonate for decades to come. The laws are clear, both domestic and international. Domestic laws in many countries, including here, saying you cannot export arms to countries that, or to groups that use them to deny human rights to other people who mistreat them. And these laws are routinely ignored, with the exception of 1 or 2 small little things that Canada did or Great Britain did. And the U.S. completely ignores this still for the moment. And international law, the ICJ, the UN General Assembly resolutions and others have clearly said this is a genocide or is a plausible genocide and it must be stopped. People cannot help the genocide go on or they're complicit under the law. So we have to understand what's the use of these laws. I'm not saying that they're good or they're bad, I'm just questioning their role. And this is one of the things that October 7 has clarified. All the UN resolutions, all the international resolutions, do they mean anything? This new rules-based international order, is this a serious reality or is it a cruel joke? And I ask those as questions and the world will have to answer them. And October 7 pushed this question to the forefront. The 7th point is the weak Arab and Islamic majority countries' response. They didn't really do much besides voting at the UN, sending humanitarian aid, and supporting the International Court of Justice case. But the very weak case very weak support from the Arab countries and Islamic Muslim majority countries is striking. But it's not striking for those of us in the Middle East. I've spent my last 55 years of adulthood living in the Arab world, going to Israel regularly and Turkey and Iran and other places, but mostly in the Arab world. And when you live in the region, you see what the reality is. And the reality is that there's a massive disjunction between, or disconnect between the citizenry and the state. And this is an element that we have to consider as one of the things that we must analyze to understand what October 7 did. It clarified very strongly this disconnect. And you see it in public opinion polls and street protests and other things. The eighth point is October 7 and its ramifications, meaning mainly the Israeli assault on Gaza, and I'm trying to use relatively descriptive neutral terms, so I'll just say the assault, the attack, and the action, because if you start using adjectives, you start getting into difficult territory to allow us to have a good discussion. But the original Hamas attack and the Israeli response both have generated clear and serious stresses on some of the core principles of Western democratic life: freedom of speech, equality of rights, due process, the role of public education systems, the role of the media. All of these have been severely stressed now, both by the protests in the US and in Europe against those government policies to support the Israeli action, and by others pushing back, pro-Israeli groups pushing back, trying to prevent these kinds of expressions of protests from happening. And this has already influenced core American principles of democratic pluralism. And we have to keep our eye on that. And the last point I would make is that the summary of all of this, and many other points we could talk about, but the summary is that I believe we're seeing all of these dimensions. We're seeing this intensity. We're seeing the damages done in various spheres because most of the people in the South see this as the last anti-colonial struggle in the world, the last anti-colonial struggle in the world, which is the Palestinians struggling against the Israelis who occupied them and disenfranchised them, et cetera, et cetera. And that, it's settler colonialism is the term that is more frequently used now. And the settler colonial process is still going on. Israel is still bringing in people from around the world, driving Palestinians out of their homes in the West Bank and elsewhere, and creating more Jewish settlements. So this is, the Israeli actions are the last functional, active, late 19th century white European colonial settler system that's still active today. And this is the Arab perspective. The Israeli perspective will be very different. But the intensity of the global response is explained, I believe, by this sense of people all around the South that we understand what's happening in Palestine. We understand why the Palestinians are fighting back. We may not agree with the tactics that Hamas uses or somebody else uses, but we understand what's going on. And because it's the last anti-colonial global struggle, the counter-response from the North, especially Great Britain and the United States, and of course from Israel, is equally severe. This is an existential battle, the greatest battle of modern history, the battle of Western, white, Northern, capitalist imperialism, and colonialism all around the world. The last 300-400 years are now being put out there for the struggle to carry on. The last point I'll make is simply that the actions of many Western powers and Israel in the Middle East are one of the driving forces of the responses you get from people in the Middle East, whether public opinion polls showing that 75% see Israel and the US as the greatest national security threat in Arab countries, or 70, 80% supporting Hamas in the struggle, whatever it is. I would say if you look at, and you have to go back to the historical context, the two most significant historical moments that I would urge people to explore if they're really interested in understanding why this is going on, are 1917 and 1953. 1917 was the Balfour Declaration, and 1953 was the American-Anglo overthrow of the democratically elected regime government in Iran. We don't have time to get into details, but those two actions were the most, I believe, dramatic actions that created the greatest response. And my final sentence is, there's two words you need to keep in mind, or you should keep in mind, if you honestly and seriously want to analyze the interaction between these two parties in this dispute or any other one in the modern Arab world, Iran, Palestinians, whatever it may be, ISIS. ISIS is a separate animal, but in Iran, the Palestinians, these political nationalist-based pushbacks against Western and Israeli powers, you have to keep in mind two words. One is humiliation, and the other is resistance. And I can tell you, in my 55 years of living in the Middle East and covering these activities extensively, those are the two words that explain every major dynamic that we've seen in the last half century. Humiliation of people in the Arab region by their own governments, by Israel, by other foreign powers. Some people are humiliated, some Arabs are humiliated by what Iran is doing in the Arab world. So humiliation is widespread. But humiliation which breeds resistance. And those two things, I think, are the critical dynamics that we should keep our eye on to understand October 7th's implications in the bigger picture. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Rami. If I can turn to Barak. I know there's a lot to cover here and respond to. Given sort of where we sit and your obviously extensive experience both in Israel and now in the last couple of years in Washington, if you could comment on sort of where you believe this leaves us in terms of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Both Rami and Chuck mentioned this, but if you can dig a little bit on that in terms of maybe more specifically, or in general and more specifically with Iran. Are the two countries on the same page regarding Iran, and how might that evolve post the upcoming election here in the U.S.?
Thank you for your question. Thank you for having me. But you'll excuse me, I'm not going to answer your question. And I'm not going to answer your question because facts matter. And I'm going to address facts now. Because what you've heard in the last 15 minutes or 20 minutes, or I lost count how many minutes, were not facts. And I'm very sorry to do it, but I can't sit idly by and not respond. Because facts matter. I walked here from my hotel, not very far, 5-minute walk, and I walked through the memorial to the 9/11 attack. And after hearing Rami, I thought to myself, oh my God, maybe it was humiliation and resistance that led to the 9/11 attack. Maybe we should look at the wider context that led to the 9/11 attack. Maybe it was the US fault that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda sent the suicide bombers in the planes into the towers. Maybe. Maybe it was because of Western hegemony. Maybe it's because of the feeling of the global South about the terrible, evil North. Maybe. Why don't we do such a discussion here on September 12th, 23rd years after? Why not? Let's have such a discussion. It's been 11 months since October 7th, the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And when I listened in the last 15 minutes, I was wondering, was it Israel that attacked on October 7th? I don't know. Do you know? Do you know if it was Israel? I don't know. I'm completely confused. Because after listening to Rami, it seems that Israel attacked Gaza on October 7th. That's what happened. When you're listening to Rami, you forget, or you start, getting confused on which side entered the other side's internationally recognized borders. October 7th, and here is a fact, October 7th did not happen in Gaza. October 7th did not happen in the West Bank. It did not happen in East Jerusalem. It didn't even happen in the Golan Heights. It happened inside Israeli recognized, internationally recognized border by the UN and by the entire world, in villages and towns inside Israel, not in the occupied Palestinian territories. It was an invasion into Israeli territory. It wasn't that long ago. And I'm amazed that 11 months after, there's already a denial of October 7th and a rewriting of the history. Hamas invaded Israeli territory, okay, internationally recognized, crossed an internationally recognized border, attacked civilian towns and villages, murdered 1,200 people, most of them civilians, raped women, raped men, kidnapped 250 people. I'm not sure, but I think maybe if there's a legal expert in the audience, maybe it will help us. Is there a legal expert in the audience? Any lawyers here? I'm not sure, so you tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that murder of 1,200 people, kidnapping of 250, most of them civilians, rape of women inside an internationally recognized border, I think it's against international law. I'm not sure. Maybe. I'm not sure. I studied history. I didn't go to law school. But maybe, again, if I'm wrong here, if there's a lawyer who can say and thinks I'm wrong, raise your hand, please. So, to me, it's just amazing that we hear those things only 11 months after. And by the way, I'll tell you another fact. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, did not, I repeat, did not conclude that Israel has committed a genocide in Gaza. Okay? That's a fact. Okay? Does this mean that everything Israel is doing in Gaza is okay? Not at all. Okay? That's the understatement of the century. Okay? But the fact that we're trying now, 11 months after, to say we need to look at the context. You know what? I'll give you context. In 2007, a year after Israel pulled out of Gaza, okay, pulled out of Gaza, took 8,000 Israeli settlers, sent the military, took them with their arms and legs into buses and bust them out of Gaza. Then it took bulldozers, bulldozed their homes, bulldozed their synagogue, and you know what else they bulldozed? They even bulldozed the cemeteries and took everything out. A year later, Hamas conducted the military coup in Gaza. Hamas is by the way, is a recognized terrorist organization according to the US government, according to the EU, according to the UK, according to Canada, according to Australia, according to New Zealand, according to many other countries. It conducted in 2007 a military coup throughout the Palestinian Authority, which is a body of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is the internationally recognized representative of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian national movement. It kicked them out of Gaza. It killed I think around 100 members of the Palestinian Authority security forces, threw them off the roofs, okay, shot their kneecaps, threw them out, took over in a military coup. Okay, a terrorist organization. That's the context. Okay? Not the Balfour Declaration. Okay? Hamas did not conduct October 7th because of the Balfour Declaration. Okay? I assure you. It did not. So, again, I'm sorry I was, diverting the discussion, but it's just, to me, it's just unbelievable. It's just unbelievable that we're sitting here 50 feet from the 9/11 memorial, and we're trying to find excuses for terrorist attacks. Excuses and humiliation, resistance. Excuse me, this is, I'm sorry, it's just preposterous. I felt like, I don't know if it was my head that was exploding or my ears that were burning up, but it's not done. It's not done. We cannot find excuses and explanations for terrorist attacks. I'm sorry. We just can't do it. Does this mean that what Israel has been doing in Gaza in the last 11 months is okay? It is not. There are tens of thousands of innocent civilians that were killed in indiscriminate bombings by the Israeli military in Gaza. Okay? But this does not mean that now we can say that Israel started the whole thing and that it's Israel's fault. It is not. And even those of us who see themselves as intellectuals are trying to, do those intellectual exercises in order to explain why it's more complicated than you think. It is not more complicated than you think. It's pretty simple. It's pretty simple. And you know why it's simple? Because we all saw it. We saw it. You saw the redhead mother with the two redhead babies in her hands getting taken from their beds in the kibbutz in Israel to Gaza, to the tunnels in Gaza, and then murdered there. We all saw it. It's not something that, it's as if, I don't want to make comparisons, but, it's like I heard the other day, I don't know if you watch Tucker Carlson, not sure that's the audience, but Tucker Carlson hosted a professor that explained that actually, Hitler was doing a favor to the Jews in the Holocaust when he exterminated them. Okay? I really don't think, and this is, 80 years after, I can understand how such twisted ideas come to people's heads. But 11 months after? Are we out of our mind? So I'm sorry again for diverting the discussion. That was my contribution to this panel. Thank you.
No, thank you, Barak. I appreciate it and certainly respect your right to respond to that. We're running out of time, but Asaf, I want to give you the balance of our time here, maybe 5 to 6 minutes. If you're welcome to respond as well and contribute. If you would like to talk about more specifically from a terrorism perspective on Hamas,
Sure.
But the floor is yours.
I think I'm
Asaf.
just going to bore everybody to death by answering a question about Hamas. So in terms of, maybe I'll speak a bit about Hamas, and then maybe if I'll have a minute or two left about the October 7th attacks, and I think its significance for terrorism writ large. So I think Hamas is, it's a very, very complicated, complex, multidimensional organization to deal with, and I think one of the reasons is that if we kind of try to disaggregate the organization, it has different layers, right? So first of all, right, as Barak has said, of course, it's a terrorist organization, and that really is its essence. And so the counterterrorism implication for that is that, requiring to deal with Hamas involves, first of all, good old, counterterrorism work, right? All the tools in the toolbox, right? Intelligence, military efforts, and so forth. The second the second dimension or identity of Hamas is that as a social and political movement, right? With origins in the Muslim Brotherhood, who also wages, who not only uses terrorism, even though, again, that is its essence, right? But it relies heavily, of course, on broader insurgency strategies, different modes of warfare. It combines guerrilla and terrorism. And so in some ways, right, the Israeli response to Hamas has to be more than simply counterterrorism. It has to use some tools from the counterinsurgency toolbox, right, creating conditions that will enable an alternative form of governance in Gaza, of course, ensuring that civilian casualties are kept to a minimum, and so forth. Third, Hamas has another identity, and that is as a proxy of Iran, right? It's not its most important identity. It's not the most important proxy of Iran, but it is a proxy in some ways, right? It receives and there are people here in the audience who know this better than I do, but it receives anywhere from, I don't know, 100 million upwards of military assistance from Iran, right, every year, maybe as much as $200, $300 million per year. And so here, right, here the response has to involve basically, right, breaking up the link between Hamas and Iran. And that to me is something which actually is not just Israel's problem, because to me, right, Iran's, of course, which has heavily, significantly relied on its strategy of using proxies. It's not just a problem for Israel, right? Israel is part of a much greater game. And so that attempt to break up Hamas from Iran is something that has to be done through international cooperation. And then a fourth kind of way of thinking of Hamas is it's of course also an ideology, and it's an idea, right? An idea that has quite a bit of resonance in Gaza, in the West Bank, of course, but also beyond, right? And that's because Hamas has been very, very adept, of course, with many other supporters and influencers, right, of presenting basically Israel as colonialist, apartheid, genocide state. I think we've heard a good example today. But this too actually is not just an Israeli problem, because this is also part of a much greater game, right? Because this attempt, right, to delegitimize Israel, actually, it's not just an attempt to delegitimize Israel, right? It's actually, I mean, ask yourself, what is the axis of resistance? What is the axis of resistance actually resisting? They're not just resisting Israel. They're resisting the West more broadly. They're resisting ideas and values of democracy and liberalism, right? And we've seen this, and we've heard this actually, don't take my word for it, we've heard Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, right, talk about the extent of the threat posed by Iran. And maybe just a couple of, if I have 2 more minutes, just a few words about the October 7th attacks and its broader implications on terrorism. So, right, I'm an American citizen who's been deeply impacted by 9/11, and this has been, of course, a national trauma. I live in Israel now for a number of years. But just, I think one of the novel kind of ways of October 7th is, first of all, the sheer scale, right? Imagine if 9/11 killed not just 3,000, but 32,000 people, right? Imagine that 10,000 of those 30,000 were brutally massacred at a music festival. Imagine that 7,000 Americans in 9/11 would have been kidnapped, and that 3,000 of them are still kidnapped and held by a murderous terrorist organization. That is the scale of what happened on October 7th to Israel if you take the demographics into account, right? So it's a massive scale. It has been a national trauma for Israel. So that's one kind of important aspect of October 7th to keep in mind, right? The novelty of it is just the sheer scale. The second, I think, is that the October 7th attacks were not just a terrorist attack, right? But they were something much more broader. They were a combination of a terrorist and a military surprise attack, right? There have been 6,000 or so people who have been infiltrating into Israel, right? About just short of 4,000 elite Nukhba forces of Hamas, 2,000 or so civilians and members of other groups, 119 entry points into Israel, 21 communities that were massacred, right? And so this is not just Israel's 9/11, but it's Israel's 9/11 plus the Tet Offensive, right? I think this is kind of like, and it's novel, right? Because I think that as we think about what we used to call terrorist organizations before, terrorist organizations, the contemporary terrorist organizations are much broader, right? They're organizations that are relying also on guerrilla warfare. Many, oftentimes they hold territory, they can conduct these kinds of attacks. And then the third and last thing I'm going to say, just in terms of the October 7th and the novelty, and it's not entirely novel, but the information operation aspect of the attack, I think, is very important. Now, of course, right, previous terrorist attacks, including 9/11, right, they were accompanied by various forms of propaganda and information operations. But before, I think these information operations were done in a way that kind of amplified, right, the objectives or the military attack, right? They were an addendum almost to the attacks. But when we look at October 7th, they're not just an addendum, right? The information operation, which has international resonance, it's more than simply an amplifier of the military attack against Israel. It's part and parcel of the strategy. It's part of the strategy of Hamas and its supporters and its enablers for victory. It's the only way, really, in which Hamas can survive is by expanding It's information warfare, and hoping that it's going to delegitimize Israel faster than Israel can disrupt and degrade and eliminate Hamas. So it's the extent, it's the scale of information operations that I think is also very, very important to keep in mind.
All right, thank you, Saf, and thank you to the panel. We have a hard stop to be out of the room in like 2 minutes for lunch. So thank you, everybody, and if you everybody collect your things, and if I can ask you to grab your stuff and head out, and we can talk outside. Thank you.